Okay, so we'll continue on from that point. We're talking about if I'm dimensioning something where it has a small gap, let's say. So small gap being very small, or there's specifications as to how big or how small a gap should be before we have to move our dimension and or extensions outside of the gap, so to speak, the gap being in between your extension lines. So if you have a reasonably small gap, if I'm doing it by hand, you could put the dimension itself in the gap and put your extensions on the outside. If it's a very small gap, you're going to probably have to put both outside of the gap in between the two dimension lines. And of course, what the heck would this be describing? Well, it could be describing something like this, where I've got maybe some kind of a gap in between. All right, so if you've got room to put both in, as we had done here, we did on our previous page, if I've got room to put both in between the two dimension lines, go for it. If you've only got room to put one or the other, well, that's fine. Just put whichever one you can. For our purposes, what we're doing by hand, it's not really, there's not a hard and fast rule that says you have to put the dimension or you have to put the extension in. Just put whichever one makes the most sense. Our goal here is just to kind of be descriptive and try to communicate our purposes. And if we need more precise than that, we're going to go to a CAD software and let it do that for us. But basic techniques for dimensioning by hand we can talk about. So I'm going to post for our class, I'm going to post some scans and some notes from a couple of textbooks and give you some more information. But we are going to talk about general dimensioning rules and practices. So some things that we should and shouldn't do. I'm going to use a different pen that writes a little better. All right, so rule number 1. Everything is dimensioned once and only once. Everything is dimensioned once and only once. And if we're in class, here's where I ask the question, who can tell me the first rule of Fight Club? And of course, some people will chuckle. And if you've seen the movie, it's an American classic. It's Brad Pitt, Edward Norton Jr. Go look it up, right? Go stream it somewhere. But the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Right? And the second rule of Fight Club, and I'll ask, okay, who can tell me the second rule of Fight Club? Well, the second rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. It's a very secret society and they don't want to talk about it. So if I'm in class, what I would say is, all right, well, the first rule of dimensioning is everything is dimensioned once and only once. And then the second rule of dimensioning is that everything is dimensioned once and only once. It's very important. We don't over dimension. Just like in SolidWorks, if you put too many dimensions on something, it gives you the blow up message and says, you've over defined. This is over defined. This is what we call over defined, where you've dimensioned something more than once. You dimension everything once and only once. That's rule number 1. That's rule number 2. All right, we're going to stop there and pick up the next video.